Chapter 961. Gu Shengyin was silent for a bit, then said, "System, draw a skill." She prayed in her heart that she would be given a useful skill. After all, in the previous world, she had drawn a piano skill in the ancient world, so she didn't have the energy to complain. A white light flashed, and Gu Shengyin listened to the system's notification. A powerful self-healing ability of the blood race, able to drink blood and recover strength in a short period of time? Gu Shengyin read out loud. She was the goddess of nature, so why would she be given a blood race's ability? The system remained silent. Gu Shengyin comforted herself. It's better than piano skills and cooking skills. After drawing the skill, she began to think about her current situation. Katrina was currently in a weakened state, so she needed to find an oracle to become her successor and spread her gospel across the continent. Actually, Gu Shengyin couldn't understand these gods. Even though he was already so weak, he still had to wait for an oracle to spread his faith. If she couldn't find one, she would continue to wait. Couldn't she spread it herself? When Gu Shengyin asked this question, the system remained silent. This was a question that even the system hadn't thought of, let alone the gods. The system replied, "The gods are of noble status, how could they do such a thing themselves?" Gu Shengyin sneered, "That's what I don't understand. You can't even maintain your true spirit, yet you're still not thinking of a way to spread your faith, but relying on the power of an oracle to spread your believers." Perhaps she wasn't a real god, so she couldn't understand the pride and nobility of these so-called gods. She only knew that she was here to complete a mission. As long as she could stop Hedi from becoming her oracle, prevent her from being killed, and spread the faith of the goddess of nature Katrina throughout the continent, her mission would be considered complete. As for the process, the laws of the world didn't stipulate that gods could only sit on their thrones and look up at the stars every day, right? The figure on the throne flickered and disappeared without a trace. At the same time, a green-robed woman with light blonde hair appeared in the hall. She wore a green leaf crown on her long hair, and her face was delicate and gentle, with a gentle smile on her lips. In her right hand, she held a magic wand that was about the same height as her. Paired with a dark cloak on top of the green robe, she looked exactly like the oracles recorded in the ancient books. "System, how is my appearance?" Gu Shengyin turned around and asked. The system replied honestly, "It's very deceiving." Gu Shengyin was speechless. He knew it wouldn't say anything nice. Also, what was deceiving? The goddess of nature had personally transformed into an oracle. Was there anything more realistic than this? However, the system's words' appearance. Gu Shengyin's lips curled into a mysterious smile. Then let's set off and begin the journey of the goddess of nature's faith. With her, an omnipotent oracle, she would like to see what he, who was merely an oracle of a fallen god, could do. Lord Roy, that 9-colored deer ran into the green light forest. The mighty group of knights stopped outside a lush forest. Their prey had just escaped from here. The green light forest was the domain of the goddess of nature. It was said that the goddess of nature had once given an oracle that all creatures that entered the green light forest would be protected by her. Chapter 962. Unless they gave up on the hunt, they would have to enter this forest to continue chasing their prey. Lord Roy. All the knights looked at their master. After all, the green forest was the domain of the goddess of nature. The legends of the 5 main gods had lasted for tens of thousands of years on this continent. Even though humans no longer respected the gods as much as they did in the past, they still respected the goddess of nature from the bottom of their hearts. The leading knight was called Lord Roy. He had long golden hair that was as dazzling as the sun. It was carefully tied up and let down behind his head. His face was completely different from the color of his hair. His facial features were handsome and deep, but his sea-blue eyes were like the coldest gemstones, without a trace of warmth. He frowned and thought carefully. Finally, he spat out 2 words coldly, "Go in." This meant that they were going in to continue the hunt. One of the knights in the team hesitated. "But Lord, this is the domain of the goddess of nature." Roy coldly raised the corner of his lips. "The goddess of nature? Now, who has seen the descent of a god?" Regardless of whether it existed or not, this was no longer their era. I have. A soft voice was heard. This voice seemed to come from a very far place because it sounded faintly discernible in the eyes of the knights. However, she was clearly very close to them, so close that it was as if she was whispering in their ears. Roy's gaze swept in a certain direction like a sharp sword. Over there, where there was originally no one, a green figure slowly appeared. The 9-colored deer that they had not been able to catch after paying a huge price was lying docilely under her body. Oracle, Roy said with certainty as he looked at her attire. Gu Shengyin raised her head and looked at them. Her delicate facial features were fully displayed under the sunlight. She smiled and spread out her hands. Yes, the oracle of the goddess of nature, Bess, welcome to the green forest. The moment she spread out her hands, a breeze suddenly blew through the entire forest. Countless trees rustled and branches swayed, as if they were welcoming these uninvited guests with her words. Everything seemed very peaceful and beautiful. The knights in the team all grasped the weapons in their hands tightly. The sudden appearance of this person who claimed to be the oracle of the goddess of nature was too strange. Gu Shengyin didn't mind the silence. She knew that she was not the one who was anxious. They would speak eventually. Sure enough, after a short silence, Roy said, "Oracle of the goddess of nature, we need the 9-colored deer beside you." Gu Shengyin lowered her head and seemed to say something. Then she raised her head and said helplessly, "I just asked little 9. He is not willing to leave with you." Roy frowned and said coldly, "Whether it's willing or not, I'm taking it away today." The rest of the knights gripped their weapons tightly. According to their experience, once the negotiations between the two sides broke down, it would be time for conflict. He didn't know what this strange and beautiful woman would do. To everyone's surprise, Gu Shengyin only smiled helplessly at their reaction. The goddess of nature treats all living beings equally. You want little 9. Is there a reason? Maybe I can help you? Chapter 963. Roy did not speak. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the woman in front of him with an inquisitive expression. Gu Shengyin still had her gentle smile as she waited for their next words. What broke the silence was a knight behind Roy. The knight was the one who had hesitated and said that this was the domain of the goddess of nature. Gu Shengyin could see traces of white faith power from him. Clearly, this knight was a person of faith. "Your Excellency Roy, perhaps we can let this oracle give it a try." The knight looked at Roy with pleading eyes. His family had been believers of God since he was young. Although he did not believe in the goddess of nature, he still respected this powerful goddess very much in his heart. He did not want to see his group clash with the oracle of the goddess of nature. Roy frowned and looked at the green-robed oracle in front of him again. This woman always had a calm smile on her face, as though everything was under her control. He nodded imperceptibly. The knight understood what he meant, and a hint of joy appeared on his face. He walked toward Gu Shengyin and slowly explained the whole story to her. They were from the Wrath Empire. This time, a plague suddenly broke out on a large scale in the Blue Sea province on the border of the Wrath Empire, and many people died. The person in charge of the South Sea province tried everything but to no avail. In the end, he had no choice but to seek help from the Empire's headquarters. Unfortunately, the envoys sent by the Empire's capital were still unable to solve this problem. It was not until someone suggested that the legendary 9-colored deer of nature had the ability to expel all misfortune and plagues that they specially came to the vicinity of the Greenlight Forest to try their luck. After the knight finished speaking, he looked at Gu Shengyin sincerely. "Your Excellency, we want this 9-colored deer not because of greed, and we won't harm it." His words disappeared under Gu Shengyin's knowing gaze. Gu Shengyin's gaze was still gentle, but her words left the knight speechless. The 9-colored deer is a symbol of auspiciousness and luck. Her blood is the most precious tonic. Little 9 went to a human city. Can she really come back? Knight lowered his head in embarrassment. Indeed, a precious divine beast like the 9-colored deer was definitely a treasure in the human world. In particular, a drop of the 9-colored deer's blood could extend the lifespan of an ordinary person, and warriors and magicians could use it to reach a higher level. At that time, even if they wanted to protect the 9-colored deer, would they really be able to? Gu Shengyin spoke again. It's just a few small plagues. I can go with you to take a look. The knight was overjoyed, but before he could say anything, Roy, who had been sitting on the horse, said in a cold tone, "Can you guarantee to solve the problem of the Ocean Blue Province?" Gu Shengyin didn't get angry when she heard this obvious question. Instead, she smiled and said, "Whether or not I can solve it, you will see the effect later. But I can be sure that Little Nine has no way to solve the problem you are talking about." The 9-colored deer was only an auspicious beast. It was true that it could purify misfortune and plagues, but if it was man-made dark magic, the 9-colored deer could not do anything. Chapter 964. As if responding to Gu Shengyin's words, as soon as she finished speaking, the 9-colored deer that had been docile beside her raised its head and cried out. Gu Shengyin was certain that what happened in the Aquamarine province was definitely not as simple as a natural plague. Because she felt a familiar power. Roy stared at Gu Shengyin and finally said, "I hope you can do what you said." Gu Shengyin answered him with a smile. The knights prepared a horse for her, but Gu Shengyin did not move. She stood in place and said with a calm expression, "As the messenger of the goddess of nature, I promise to help you solve your predicament. Don't you need to do something?" Roy paused and immediately said, "As long as you can successfully solve the problem of the Aquamarine province, I will naturally report your achievements to His Majesty the Emperor. At that time, I can fight for whatever reward you want." He didn't know why, but a wave of disappointment suddenly welled up in his heart. He felt that this person should not be so unscrupulous. Gu Shengyin shook her head. The eyes of the goddess of nature looked to every corner of the continent. "If you need her help, you should pray." The eyes of the knight who had been standing beside her lit up. He suddenly clasped his hands in front of his forehead and chanted in a low voice. This was the oldest prayer chant that had been passed down from 10,000 years ago. Everyone would be taught this prayer after they were born, but now, except for the truly devout believers, very few people would really use it. This knight was obviously a loyal believer. Gu Shengyin could feel a trace of almost imperceptible energy being transmitted from the knight's body and pouring into her body. Although she only felt her body warm up slightly, it was not even comparable to the bright sunlight. But at least it proved that the power of faith was effective for her. Gu Shengyin looked at him with satisfaction and then looked at the others. Roy said in a deep voice, "We are not believers of the goddess of nature." Gu Shengyin interrupted him. "I don't need your faith, but there's no problem in asking for the help of the goddess of nature. It's a prayer that doesn't waste much energy, right? Even if you ask others for help, you still need to thank them," Gu Shengyin said in a light tone. When they thought about it, they felt that it made sense. She did not ask for anything excessive, so they just treated it as asking for her help. Gu Shengyin was in a good mood as she watched the knights finish their prayers one by one. She rejected the horses they offered to her and sat lightly on the back of the 9-colored deer. The knights, "Since you want to sit on the 9-colored deer to go to the Aquamarine province, why did you say so much before?" The devout knight clearly had a good impression of Gu Shengyin. He looked at the eye-catching 9-colored deer worriedly. "Oracle, I'm afraid it's not appropriate for you to take the 9-colored deer to a human city." Gu Shengyin looked at him with a smile. "Don't worry. With me here, no one can have any ideas about Little Nine." She still had that indifferent expression on her face and that gentle smile on her face. But the moment she said this, the knight clearly felt an indescribable arrogance from her. Since Gu Shengyin said so, the knight did not say anything else and just followed behind her dutifully. Roy, on the other hand, looked at Gu Shengyin thoughtfully before leaving. Chapter 965. Gu Shengyin, who was riding a 9-colored deer, unsurprisingly received the attention of countless people. Among those gazes, there was curiosity, shock, surprise, and greed. Gu Shengyin did not seem to see them as she followed the knights all the way to the border of the Aquamarine province. As soon as she entered the Aquamarine province, Gu Shengyin became certain. Her guess was right. This incident was not a natural disaster at all, but a man-made one. Roy's attention had always been on this strange oracle. Seeing her strange expression, he asked, "How do you feel?" Gu Shengyin met his dark blue eyes and said with a smile, "I think I can solve the problem here." Roy raised his eyebrows and did not say anything. "She's so sure?" Ever since a large number of infected casualties appeared in the Aquamarine province, the person in charge here had thought of all the ways he could think of, including asking an oracle to pray for the blessings of the gods. But if an oracle was useful, he would not have specially come here from the imperial capital. Whether this person could do it or not, it was better to let the facts speak for themselves. Gu Shengyin knew that the other party did not trust her, but she did not mind this. What she needed the most now was not his trust at all. The situation in the Aquamarine province was very grim, so Roy did not delay at all and directly invited her to the City Lord's mansion in Aquamarine City. Hearing that she was someone who could solve the plague in the Aquamarine province, the City Lord looked at Gu Shengyin with tears in his eyes. During this period of time, he was simply worried sick about this matter. Even his hair had turned white by quite a bit. Originally, with his qualifications, he had stayed here for long enough. Once he successfully survived this period, he would definitely be transferred back to the imperial capital in the future, and his future path would definitely be smooth. But he just had to encounter this matter. If he could not solve it successfully, not to mention being transferred back to the imperial capital for a promotion, he might not even be able to keep his life. Gu Shengyin also knew that this matter could not be delayed. She quickly explained what she needed. "That's all?" the City Lord asked suspiciously. "That's all." Gu Shengyin nodded. She looked to the Aquamarine City Lord and said, "What I can guarantee is that I will solve the Aquamarine province's predicament when you prepare the things I want according to my requirements." Her calm demeanor calmed the Lord of Aquamarine City, who had been hesitating for a long time. "All right, Lord Oracle, I'll do as you say as soon as possible." The Lord of Aquamarine City ordered his men to bring Gu Shengyin to a good guest room and left in a hurry. Gu Shengyin gently stroked the 9-colored deer's smooth fur, while thinking about the ocean blue province. From the moment she entered, she felt an extremely familiar yet annoying power. Hermes, the god of darkness. As one of the 5 main gods, Hermes was different from the other 4 main gods. He had never been favored by humans. His believers were all abyssal demons from the other side of the continent. As humans grew stronger and stronger, the abyssal demons were expelled, and Hermes became the first of the main gods to fall into a deep slumber. She was certain that this matter had nothing to do with Hermes. It must have been some humans who had obtained the inheritance of the god of darkness, but were unable to control such a large amount of dark power, resulting in such serious consequences. Gu Shengyin could have quietly expelled the power of darkness from his body. But how could she give up such a good opportunity to develop her faith? Chapter 966. Gu Shengyin's mind was going through a series of steps to develop faith, when a maid from the City Lord's mansion knocked on the door. "Lord Oracle, someone is looking for you." That maid's attitude towards Gu Shengyin was very respectful. "Let her in." Gu Shengyin already knew who it was. She never thought that her first meeting with He Di would be under such circumstances. He Di originally planned to leave the City Lord's mansion today. She was forcibly invited by the City Lord's mansion to solve the problem of the Aquamarine province. But her title as an oracle was fake, so how could she solve the problem? He Di could only act like a duck on a perch and pretend to contact the gods. The consequences could be imagined. Fortunately, the City Lord of the Aquamarine province was not a murderous person, and he had invited many people, but no one could do anything about it, so he did not blame He Di. Today, when He Di was about to leave, she heard the 2 maids quietly talking, saying that those powerful Sir Knights had invited a Sir Oracle over, saying that she could solve the current predicament of the Aquamarine province. Sir Knight. He Di knew who they were talking about as soon as she heard it. Speaking of which, she was invited here after all, so she enjoyed the treatment of a VIP in the City Lord's mansion. Everyone in the City Lord's mansion, from the maids to the City Lord himself, treated her politely. Only that group of knights, who were said to have come from the imperial capital, were not polite to her at all. Especially the leader, although he admitted that he was very handsome. His temper was as cold as his handsomeness. Someone like him would invite people? He was very curious about that mysterious oracle, so before leaving the city lord's mansion, she specially prepared to come and see for herself. She was brought in by the maid. At first glance, she was attracted by the 9-colored deer standing quietly on the side. This mythical beast that existed in legends had a smooth and elegant posture, and the flower-like antlers on the top of its head were gorgeous. Standing there, it seemed to be glowing. The legendary 9-colored deer. A 9-colored deer that could extend one's life by 10 years just by drinking a mouthful of blood. He's gaze unconsciously became hot. She almost couldn't help but want to go closer. Fortunately, her rationality told her that there was another person here. Gu Shengyin was originally sitting sideways, but when she saw her, she turned around. Hello. Gu Shengyin didn't get up. She just nodded slightly in greeting. No one thought that her action was impolite. Even he felt that this woman was born to sit elegantly like this. There was nothing in the world that was worthy of her bending over. Hello. For some reason, he was inexplicably nervous when she was looked at by that pair of penetrating and gentle eyes. She even began to stutter when she spoke. Gu Shengyin's enormous divine spirit power swept past He in an instant, but no one noticed it. As expected, this woman only had the name of an oracle. She didn't have any faith on her at all, nor was there any mark left by the gods. Gu Shengyin looked over with a questioning look in his eyes. For some reason, He's ability to speak eloquently didn't work at all in front of Gu Shengyin. Her face flushed red, and she finally found an excuse. I heard that a new oracle came to the city lord's mansion, so I wanted to come over and pay my respects. What was wrong with her today? Why was she so abnormal? A smile flashed across Gu Shengyin's eyes. He's abnormal behavior was of course because she secretly used a trace of divine power when she looked at her. It wasn't easy to lie in front of the gods. Chapter 967. He finally left the city lord's mansion in a sorry state. The person in front of her did not do anything, but she felt that she had no reservations in front of her. Even the deepest secret in her heart was seen through at a glance. This should be an illusion. But this illusion was so real that it made her feel uneasy. Her vision told her that she should stay away from that woman. Gu Shengyin watched He leave with a smile on her face. The most important thing for her now was to recover her divine power and gather faith as soon as possible. As for He, she was just an ordinary human. Without Katrina's unconditional indulgence, she could not make any waves at all. The city lord's mansion acted quickly. After resting for a night, when Gu Shengyin woke up the next day, the city lord was already waiting outside. Lord Oracle, everything you want has been prepared. The city lord saw her with a hint of eagerness in his eyes. The city lord is kind-hearted. Gu Shengyin saw the red veins in the city lord's eyes and knew that he had not slept all night. She moved the magic wand in her hand gently, and a gentle energy was transmitted to the city lord's body. The city lord felt comfortable all over, and the fatigue from staying up all night disappeared without a trace. Thank you, Lord Oracle. The city lord thanked her sincerely. Gu Shengyin returned a smile. As the two spoke, they arrived at their destination. It was just a tall building. Because they were in a hurry, the materials used were the easiest to collect wood. There were 999 steps leading up, and at the top was a high platform. Gu Shengyin's destination. I'll have to trouble the city lord to wait for me here. Gu Shengyin finished speaking and slowly walked up the steps. Her steps were very leisurely, but not slow at all. In the blink of an eye, she reached the highest point. This place was completely empty. There was nothing here. The city lord stood below nervously. He did not know what the other party was up to, nor did he know if she could really solve the current predicament of Aquamarine City as she said. Footsteps came from behind. It was Roy, who had heard the news. A gentle wind blew towards Gu Shengyin from high above, causing her wide sleeves to flutter, as if she was about to be blown away by the wind. Gu Shengyin closed her eyes and raised her wand high up in the air. Then, she slowly and softly chanted an incantation. Her voice was soft and gentle, and she was standing at such a high place. Logically speaking, the beauty should be able to hear her. But the city lord of Aquamarine, who was standing under the tall building, heard it. Roy heard it. The attendants in the city lord's mansion heard it. All the people of the entire Aquamarine province heard this beautiful chant that sounded like a song. No one could understand what was being sung, but everyone knew that this strange melody was praising the great goddess of nature. On the high platform where no one could see clearly, with Gu Shengyin as the center, a circular magic circle with a diameter of 10 meters suddenly formed. The light from the complex pattern even covered the bright sky. Gu Shengyin's chanting grew louder. Gradually, it spread from everyone's ears to the wind, the streets, the sky, and every corner of the Aquamarine province. Following the transmission of this voice, a faint green light was born from the air. It was omnipresent and quietly flowed past everyone's body. Chapter 968. Those who were not infected by the power of darkness only felt refreshed after the green light passed through their bodies. As for the others, they only felt that the pain and torture that had been plaguing their bodies for countless days and nights seemed to be pulled out of their bodies by something invisible, and infinite strength grew from inside their bodies. The chanting continued. People slowly stopped what they were doing, as if they had received a mysterious summon in their minds. Without anyone teaching them, they began to clasp their hands together and press them against their foreheads. Following the mysterious chanting, they began to sing praises. Thank you, beautiful and benevolent goddess of nature, for passing the power of life to me. Flowers and green leaves are your hair crown, and the gurgling clear stream is your bright gaze. Roy looked back. More than half of the people around him began to sing the praises of the goddess of nature. Even the city lord of Aquamarine did not avoid it. His gaze as he looked at the high platform suddenly became unfathomable. If such a powerful infectious ability was used in other aspects, Gu Shengyin felt countless faith power pouring into her body from all directions, allowing her body, which had just overdrawn from using magic, to quickly recover its strength. She watched with satisfaction as the invisible black mist was swallowed by the green light and disappeared without a trace. Half an hour later, the city lord of Aquamarine saw Gu Shengyin walking down from the high platform. She still had that gentle look on her face, but the way everyone looked at her had changed. There was even a fanatical light in some people's eyes. Your Excellency, the goddess of nature is really... The city lord of Aquamarine's eyes were filled with amazement. He was a person who did not believe in gods, but the scene he saw today was too unbelievable. Gu Shengyin smiled mysteriously. The goddess of nature has always been looking at everyone with her eyes. As if responding to her words, the moment she finished speaking, all the flowers in the city lord's mansion that were out of season bloomed at the same time. At the same time, an excited guard came to report the good news. Your Excellency, all the people infected by the plague in the city have recovered. The news from the other cities did not arrive so quickly, but the mayor of Aquamarine City did not doubt that the news would be good. He suddenly bent his waist and bowed solemnly to Gu Shengyin. The people of the entire Aquamarine province are grateful for your help, goddess of nature's oracle, Lady Beezy. Gu Shengyin accepted his bow and made a small request. I have no other wish in my life. I only wish to see the believers of the goddess of nature spread to every corner of the continent, just like the glorious era 10,000 years ago. The mayor of Aquamarine City immediately understood what she meant. His heart was filled with respect for such a devout believer. The goddess of nature is a great deity. I believe that the new people of Hai Lan will not reject the protection of such a powerful and benevolent deity. In the mind of the Lord of Aquamarine, he had long regarded this mysterious oracle as a powerful and somewhat loyal believer of the goddess of nature. He even suddenly felt that it was appropriate to have some faith. He didn't know that this mysterious and powerful believer was communicating with an invisible creature. System, how was my performance just now? The system replied, very good. You have the demeanor of a quack. Chapter 969. Heroine was in Aquamarine City. Because she had the qualifications to become an oracle, she could see the source of the plague that plagued humans, which was the black fog. She listened to the sacred chanting and watched as the green light spots appeared out of thin air and swallowed up the black fog that everyone was helpless against. Heroine only felt that her understanding had been overturned. Even when she was taken away by a mysterious person and later inexplicably became the oracle of the water god, Heroine had never had any faith in her heart. She also did not believe that there were gods in this world. But the scene that she saw today was too unbelievable. Other than gods, which human would have such powerful and magical power? Was there really a god? Then, as an oracle, would she be as powerful as that mysterious woman one day? She suddenly felt a fire in her heart. Her eyes focused and she headed toward the city lord's residence. Gu Shengyin was still in the city lord's residence. She's here again? Gu Shengyin felt a little strange. Her last meeting with Heroine was not a pleasant one. Why did she come again? How to become powerful? Gu Shengyin looked at Heroine with an unfathomable expression. Heroine felt a little creeped out by this look. She had a bad premonition in her heart. It made her want to stop the person opposite her from speaking. But Gu Shengyin had already said it. The source of an oracle's power is their faith and the power of the gods. I don't feel any faith in you. I'm very curious how you became an oracle. Gu Shengyin looked at her with a serious expression. As soon as she said this, everyone looked at Heroine differently. An oracle without faith? This was simply the biggest joke of all. No one doubted Gu Shengyin's words because she had just proven herself with her actions. Heroine wanted to defend herself, but the feeling from last time appeared again. In front of this mysterious woman, she had nowhere to hide. Even the slightest lie had become abnormally difficult for her to speak. In the end, Heroine couldn't stand the suspicious and disgusted gazes of the people around her. She covered her face and left hatefully. Gu Shengyin stayed in the city lord's mansion for another 3 days. Over the past 3 days, many people from Aquamarine City had come to visit her and ask her about the goddess of nature. She could clearly feel that many people in the Aquamarine province had begun to believe in the existence of the goddess of nature under her influence. She was very happy and was very patient with the people. After all, they were her believers. In the eyes of the city lord of Aquamarine, Roy, and the others, she looked even more like a person who believed wholeheartedly. The city lord of Aquamarine City had even begun preparations for the construction of the first goddess of nature temple. Many of the citizens expressed their willingness to help. On a sunny afternoon, Gu Shengyin welcomed a guest. Go to the imperial capital? Gu Shengyin looked at Roy in surprise. This man's eyes were as cold as ever. Roy nodded and said his purpose without hesitation, I want to cooperate with you. He looked straight at Gu Shengyin. I can provide you with convenience and develop believers. You need to help me get more people's support. He had seen everything that Gu Shengyin had done in the past few days. He knew what the other party wanted. Therefore, as soon as he opened his mouth, it was difficult for others to refuse. Chapter 970. Gu Shengyin was silent for a while. Roy was not in a hurry. He waited for Gu Shengyin to consider. Gu Shengyin looked up and smiled at Roy. Since you want to cooperate, I think you need to be more honest. What do you think? Archduke Roy? Roy's expression did not change, but his pupils shrank. How did you know? His identity had been concealed very well ever since he left the capital. He was certain that he did not give himself away at all. Gu Shengyin smiled. I said a long time ago that the eyes of the goddess of nature can see everything in the world that she wants to see. Roy did not comment on her words. He suddenly asked, speaking of honesty, let me ask you something. Please answer me honestly. Do gods really exist? This was also a question that countless people in this era were puzzled by. The glorious era of the gods had long passed, and no one on this continent had seen the gods descend for thousands of years. They could only see the records of the gods in the historical books. No one was sure whether it was true or just the imagination of their predecessors. Gu Shengyin suddenly looked into his eyes. Royd was taken aback. The next moment, he felt as though his consciousness had been pulled into an empty space. Light condensed in front of him, gradually forming a vague human figure. The figure's face could not be seen clearly, but from Royd's angle, he could see a gorgeous crown on her long golden hair and a golden scepter in her hand. Under the cover of the hazy divine light, Royd could only see that her exposed robe was embroidered with emerald-like green leaf patterns. "You want to see me?" An ethereal voice sounded in this space. Before Royd could speak, his vision suddenly turned black. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself still sitting on the chair in the Aquamarine City Lord's residence. Opposite him was Gu Shengyin, who was looking at him with a smile. Royd picked up the cup of tea beside him and took a sip to hide his desire. His hands trembled slightly, and fine cold sweat broke out on his back. That feeling just now, it was as if he was just a speck of dust, and in front of him was a towering mountain. How shocking! It was too terrifying. He did not want to experience such a feeling again in his life. "Do you have an answer now?" Gu Shengyin asked. Lloyd nodded. He didn't have the slightest doubt. Other than the gods, who else could give him such a feeling? The two of them chatted for a long time in the room in the afternoon. For the next half a month, Gu Shengyin stayed in Aquamarine City until the first Goddess of Nature temple was built. On that day, thousands of believers went to the Goddess of Nature's temple to pray. Gu Shengyin personally led the group prayer. On that day, after all the believers had finished their prayers, they found a green leaf that would never wither in front of them. This green leaf could protect them from accidents and diseases. This was a gift from the Goddess of Nature to her devout believers. Gu Shengyin also found an oracle from the crowd who believed in the Goddess of Nature and made her the manager of the Goddess of Nature's temple in Aquamarine City. After everything in Aquamarine City was over, Gu Shengyin bid farewell to the reluctant citizens of Aquamarine City. Riding a 9-colored deer, she followed the knights from the imperial capital and went to the most prosperous place in the Roth Empire. Chapter 971. Since Gu Shengyin already knew his identity, Lloyd did not stop her. After half a month, the group finally arrived at the most prosperous city of the Roth Empire, St. Vitus. This city was named after the first emperor of the Roth Empire. Under the curious gazes of countless people, the first thing Gu Shengyin did after entering the city was to close her eyes and carefully feel the faint aura flowing in the air. This city had almost completely lost its faith. She opened her eyes and looked at the knight beside her. "Does the Roth Empire believe in the god of war?" That knight's name was Louis Wise Kapner. Since he was able to follow Grand Duke Royd, he naturally couldn't be a nobody. In fact, in terms of title, he was also a count. Hearing Gu Shengyin's question, Louis nodded. "Yes, our Roth Empire's guardian god is the god of war. But..." A trace of sadness flashed through his eyes. But now, there were not many people left who still believed in the god of war. Even among the upper nobles, there were only 2 or 3 families left that still worshipped the god of war, not to mention the ordinary people. He did not even know how long his family could hold on. His family had always believed in the god of war because the Kapuna family had always been the family with the most oracles in the Roth Empire. Before the Age of Glory, the Kapuna family's glory was even greater than that of the royal family. But now, it had been many years since the oracles of the Kapuna family had been able to listen to the god of war's oracles. They were incomparably terrified. Whether it was the fall of the god of war or the god of war giving up on the Roth Empire, they could not accept it. Gu Shengyin understood Kapuna's unfinished words. In fact, after recognizing the faint remnants of faith in the city, she had already guessed the result. Although the god of war was a powerful god, after losing his faith, he had no choice but to fall into a deep sleep. Now, the only gods that still had a trace of consciousness were the goddess of nature Katrina, the god of light Olis, and the god of sky Uno. Even among the 5 prime gods, the god of darkness and the goddess of earth had fallen into a deep slumber. He did not know what the other 2 main gods were doing. Even Gu Shengyin could not detect their whereabouts. She comforted Louis. Although our beliefs are different, those who persist in their beliefs will eventually receive the care of the gods. Louis smiled gratefully at her. He had met countless people who didn't understand the Capuna family. Even he himself was often mocked for believing in the god of war. Louisville's faith would never be shaken by such gossip, but when he heard Gu Shengyin's encouragement, his eyes lit up for a moment. He looked at Gu Shengyin with a burning gaze. "Thank you for your blessings, Master by Sea. The Kopner family will never give up on their beliefs." Even he himself did not realize that when he looked at the oracle of the goddess of nature, there was a burning emotion hidden in his gaze. Lloyd saw it. He subconsciously frowned. This oracle of the goddess of nature was destined to walk a lonely path in the future. He did not want his capable subordinates to have too much involvement with her. Chapter 972. Royd brought Gu Shengyin to his duke's mansion. She was clearly dressed as an oracle, and she was a very beautiful woman. This woman was even riding the legendary 9-colored deer. She was brought into the duke's mansion by Grand Duke Royd, who had never been close to women. No matter which one it was enough to attract the attention of countless people. And when all this information was put together, it was enough to make the citizens of St. Vitus curious. "Your identity is not ordinary. I will introduce you to His Majesty. You have to know that the path you're about to take is not suitable for you to get too close to men," Lloyd said to Gu Shengyin with a serious expression. His identity was very prominent. He was the younger brother of the Emperor of the Roth Empire, a Grand Duke who owned a large amount of territory in the south. In the eyes of outsiders, Royd was infinitely powerful, but few could see the danger he was in. His elder brother, the Emperor of the Roth Empire, was a lecherous and incompetent man. He was interested in women, but other than that, he didn't know anything about politics. He ruled the Roth Empire into a mess. His favored subjects controlled the government, and the talents of the truly knowledgeable were buried. The Roth Empire's strength had been declining in recent years. None of the princes under the emperor had any talent. Each of them fought fiercely for their own power, but none of them put any thought into governing the country. The Emperor of the Roth Empire didn't have any objections to this, but he was very wary of his only brother, Royd. He didn't get the throne in a good way, so in his heart, he always felt that his younger brother was still unwilling to give up on the throne. One day, he would lead the army in his territory to take back what was rightfully his. In these years, Royd was very careful, not letting the emperor know anything that could be used against him. Of course, he wasn't willing to give up. If his brother was a truly capable person, then he could still tolerate it. But his brother was an idiot who didn't know anything other than pleasure and women. This idiot even wanted his life at all times. How could he endure this? He was an ambitious man, and naturally had a great desire for power. Under all these temptations, what Royd wanted was obvious: the most supreme position in the Roth Empire. But in this country, the emperor was very powerful. The people were also very loyal to the imperial power. Not to mention that the army in his territory might not be able to compete with the empire's army. Even if he won, the empire's people might not be able to accept him as a usurper monarch. Therefore, he needed someone who could grasp the hearts of the people and turn everything that was disadvantageous to him to his advantage. Then, Gu Shengyin appeared. Faith was often the thing that ruled the mind the most. Gu Shengyin froze when she heard Lloyd's words. What did he mean? Looking at Lloyd's cold expression, which didn't seem to have any intention of explaining, she frowned and thought for a moment before realizing that he was talking about Louis. Glancing at Lloyd, Gu Shengyin looked helpless. "Don't worry, I don't have any other thoughts about that child with such a firm belief. I just admire his loyalty." Lloyd raised his eyebrows, thinking, "You don't have any other intentions," but it's obvious that she doesn't think so. Also, what did a little kid mean? He glanced at Gu Shengyin's young and beautiful face. His lips moved, but he didn't say anything. Chapter 973. Grand Duke Royd brought Gu Shengyin to meet his elder brother, the Emperor of the Roth Empire, Phoebe I. Phoebe was taking in several beautiful concubines and was intoxicated by the warmth and tenderness. When he heard that his younger brother was looking for him, he was very impatient. In his eyes, his younger brother Royd represented trouble. But in order to show his benevolence, he couldn't refuse his younger brother, the Duke of the Empire. When Royd walked into the hall, he saw his elder brother looking at him with a loving smile. "My dear brother Royd, why are you looking for me?" Phoebe asked with a smile. The expression on Royd's face didn't loosen at all because the other party was the Emperor. He bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I met a very mysterious oracle during my trip to the Blue Ocean province. I don't believe in gods, but I thought you would be very interested." "Oracle?" Sure enough, Phoebe's eyes lit up when he heard this. But he quickly put on a casual look and said, "Oh, is that so? I remember you don't like this kind of person." Royd frowned. "Yes, I don't believe in these people who pretend to be gods. But this oracle seems to be very capable. I think it's necessary for you to meet her." Emperor Phoebe looked at Royd seriously and found that when the other party talked about the oracle, his eyes were trying to hide it, but there was still a trace of disgust and disapproval. Instead, he felt relieved. He understood his younger brother. He had always been very repulsed by gods, oracles, and the like. If he really admired that oracle this time, he would be suspicious. Phoebe believed in the existence of gods, but he wasn't a firm believer. He believed in gods, but he just wanted to get more benefits for himself through them. "In that case, Royd, bring her in and let me see her," the Emperor said. Royd nodded, and then a green figure walked in from the entrance of the palace. The Emperor's eyes widened in an instant. His turbid eyes stared at the graceful figure with infatuation, and he couldn't see anything else. "She's actually such a beauty," he muttered. Phoebe felt that after seeing this beauty, his new concubines that he liked very much just a moment ago instantly lost their color. She was like a vibrant flower that bloomed brilliantly. Compared to her, his beautiful concubines were like plastic handicrafts. She was beautiful, but she had lost her most important life force and soul. Gu Xingyi's expression didn't change, but a trace of disgust flashed through her heart. This Emperor's gaze was too blatant. She blinked her eyes without batting an eyelid. The Emperor felt as if his consciousness had fallen into a world of ice and snow. He couldn't help but shudder, and he no longer had the mood to admire the beauty. "Hello, Your Majesty the Emperor of the Roth Empire." Gu Xingyi lowered her head slightly and greeted Phoebe. She did not bow to him. As an oracle of the goddess of nature, she did not need to bow to any royal authority. Emperor Phoebe came back to his senses and carefully sized up Gu Xingyi. Of course, he didn't forget Royd. This oracle was clearly introduced by Royd. Logically speaking, the two should know each other, but from the moment this oracle entered until she spoke, the two didn't even look at each other. Chapter 974. Phoebe rejoiced inwardly. It was clear that the relationship between the oracle and Royd wasn't that harmonious. But he was still worried. The Emperor asked Gu Xingyi, "Oracle, I heard that you have a good relationship with my brother, Duke Royd." The Emperor did not miss Gu Xingyi's expression, so he clearly saw Gu Xingyi's frown when he addressed him as Grand Duke Royd. Gu Xingyi was silent for a moment before replying, "Duke Royd is very confident. He's a man without faith. I stayed at the Duke's residence for a night. As the oracle of the goddess of nature, I can't be his guide." Her words were rather tactful, but the Emperor could easily hear the subtext. "Duke Royd and I are different and don't work together. Our relationship isn't good at all." The Emperor suddenly laughed out loud. He stood up and walked to Royd's side. He reached out and patted him on the shoulder. "Duke Royd is indeed an atheist. I'm different from him. I definitely believe in the existence of gods." Gu Xingyi praised him at the right time. The goddess of nature always pays attention to her believers. She'll definitely know of your loyal faith. The two chatted about gods for a while. The Emperor felt that this oracle was very much to his liking, especially since she was so beautiful. She was truly a rare beauty. After listening patiently for a while, Duke Royd seemed to be unable to bear the topic between them and finally said goodbye. After Royd left, the Emperor said meaningfully, "Look, every time Grand Duke Royd hears about the gods, he becomes so impatient." He meant that an oracle like you wouldn't have a good ending with Royd. Gu Shengyin nodded respectfully. Duke Royd and the goddess of nature aren't fated to be together. The Emperor finally smiled in satisfaction. No one knew what the Emperor and the mysterious oracle talked about that day. The palace servants strangely discovered that their Emperor's attitude toward the oracle was very strange. Logically speaking, with the Emperor's personality, he wouldn't let go of such a beautiful and charming woman. So what if he was an oracle? How many oracles had the Emperor played with? With the title of God's spokesperson, it would be even more satisfying to conquer them. However, not only did His Majesty not do anything to the oracle, but his attitude toward Gu Shengyin was also a little too respectful. He didn't even have the slightest interest in the 9-colored deer by the oracle's side. Instead, he instructed his attendants to take good care of it every day. This abnormal behavior made the maids in the palace very cautious when facing Gu Shengyin. Gu Shengyin snickered. She had only used some tricks to make the Emperor believe that the goddess of nature truly existed and was looking at the continent through him. At the thought of having a god by his side, even the Emperor would feel uneasy. She took up residence in the imperial palace of the Roth Empire. Phoebe specially chose a very elegant palace and found a few of the most beautiful and considerate maids to take care of her. However, Gu Shengyin did not show any abnormalities. She was waiting for a chance for the Emperor to know her importance. Chapter 975. This opportunity came very quickly. There was a rare drought in the northwest of the Roth Empire. Although the Empire had sent many water mages and taken many remedial measures, the daily reports from the northwest still made Fibbit very annoyed. If it was during the Age of Glory, the water god's believers would only need to pray to the gods to solve this problem. But now that the water god had fallen into a long slumber, there were no more believers. It was likely that people nowadays would not think of praying to the gods. After waiting for 2 days, Gu Shengyin realized that Emperor Phoebus had no intention of looking for him at all. He sighed inwardly, thinking that the humans now relied too little on the gods. He got up and went to look for Emperor Phoebus. Inside the Emperor's palace, "The tea is so hot." Fibbit impatiently threw the tea in his hand and the teacup on the ground. The maid in charge of serving the tea trembled as she knelt on the ground. She was usually very favored, but at this moment, she was very afraid. Their Emperor was a very temperamental person. When he was happy, he could casually reward you with countless treasures, but when he was unhappy, he could also casually take your life. Today's tea was clearly brewed according to His Majesty's favorite temperature, but His Majesty was in a bad mood today. If he said it was hot, then it could only be her fault. Fibbit coldly looked at the woman kneeling in front of him, a cruel look flashing through his eyes. Just as he was about to order someone to take her away, a faint voice came from outside. "Your Majesty, your heart needs to calm down." It was as if a cool breeze had appeared out of thin air, and a feeling as gentle as water surrounded Fibbit, calming his restless heart for the past few days. Gu Shengyin's figure appeared in the hall. Fibbit narrowed his eyes and looked at Gu Shengyin. He looked down at the maid kneeling on the ground and coldly spat out a word, "Scram!" The maid hurriedly cleaned up the residue on the ground as if she had been pardoned. When she passed by Gu Shengyin, she gave her a grateful look. The people in the hall all retreated, and Fibbit quietly looked at Gu Shengyin. "What brings you here, Oracle?" Gu Shengyin smiled and said, "Of course I'm here because of your Majesty's troubles." Phoebe sneered, My trouble is..." Halfway through his sentence, he suddenly widened his eyes and looked at Gu Shengyin. "You have a way." Gu Shengyin smiled sadly and helplessly. "I've said it before. On this continent, there are very few problems that the goddess of nature can't solve. It's a pity." Phoebe's eyes lit up when he heard that the goddess of nature could solve this problem. However, Gu Shengyin paused and did not speak. He hurriedly asked, "What's a pity?" Gu Shengyin's expression was very sorrowful. It's a pity that people don't have faith. Without enough faith, the prayers of humans can't be heard by the goddess of nature, and she can't intervene in the affairs of the human world. The emperor frowned. Can the oracle be more specific? Gu Shengyin. As expected of someone without wisdom. If Lloyd was here, he would definitely understand what she wanted. She smiled and explained to Fibbit that the goddess of nature needed the prayers of humans. The more sincere the heart, the more likely the goddess of nature could hear it, and the more power she could use. Chapter 976. Phoebe's eyes lit up. He had been troubled by this matter for the past few days and had forgotten that there was a real oracle living in his palace. That was the oracle of the most powerful goddess in the legends, the goddess of nature. Just as she said, if the goddess of nature was willing to help, there was nothing that couldn't be solved. As for the condition Gu Shengyin mentioned, it was simple. The good thing about being the emperor was that he could get whatever he wanted done immediately. A notice was sent to all the citizens of the imperial city. It was an introduction to a goddess. The goddess of nature. Actually, many people knew about this goddess, probably because they had heard of her legends. But, wasn't she just a goddess from the legends? Why would they be sent such a thing? Many people curiously opened the small booklet and were immediately attracted by the beautiful illustrations and beautiful descriptions. In the booklet, there was a detailed record of the goddess of nature's position, domain, and some of her past deeds on this continent. Many people who saw it were shocked. These things were written so realistically, it was as if they had seen it with their own eyes. Moreover, some of the deeds in the booklet were indeed related to some famous events in history. This was something that the emperor ordered, and some of the more sensitive people had already noticed the emperor's intention. Could it be that the emperor suddenly had faith in the goddess of nature? Flipping to the back of the booklet, there was an order from the emperor. One day later, at St. Vita Square in the imperial city, everyone would witness a miracle. Miracle. Just these two words were enough to make countless people go crazy. Even those who didn't believe in the existence of gods would be intrigued by the word gods. Below, there was a requirement to go to St. Vita Square. That was, everyone had to pray to the goddess of nature tonight. Gu Shengyin didn't count how many people followed the instructions. She only felt an endless stream of faith flowing into her body. Her body was more stable, and her desolate temple was slowly repairing itself. She could already see the glory of the glorious era. The next day, since morning, there were people rushing to St. Vita Square. Most of the people successfully entered the square, but some of them were blocked outside by an invisible barrier. This was a formation set up by Gu Shengyin. Only believers who possessed the power of faith of the goddess of nature could enter. No matter how weak the power of faith was. As long as they had prayed according to the book last night, it was impossible for them to not be able to enter this place. Many people who had the mentality of taking a look saw this scene, and a trace of conviction appeared in their hearts. With such means, could it be that the gods had really appeared? At noon, St. Vita Square, which was large enough to accommodate tens of thousands of people, was filled with people waiting for the miracle. Even in St. Vit City, such a grand occasion could only be seen once every few years. Noon, which was the time when the miracle would happen according to the booklet. Hubert was a merchant in St. Vitus. He never believed in the existence of gods. He just wanted to see what was going on. It's already noon. Where's the promised miracle? He heard someone complain beside him. I'm just here to watch the show. TSK. Who would really believe in miracles? That's right. Schubert looked up at the sky, and thought to himself, who would believe that? 10,000 chapters today, for more to go. Today, I will make up for the 3 chapters 10 on the 26th. I need a monthly vote. From today until the 7th, there will be double monthly votes. If you have a monthly vote, please come and vote for Gao Lingji. Chapter 977. There was a sudden gust of wind in the sky. The wind was very gentle, soft and warm as it blew on everyone's body. It made them feel as if the trace of irritation that had risen in their hearts while standing in this bustling crowd had disappeared without a trace. Then, the sky suddenly darkened. It was not that the sky was dark, but it was as if a layer of soft dye had been applied to the sky during the day, darkening it by a shade. There was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Schubert heard someone exclaim in surprise. Everyone seemed to be looking up at the sky. He looked up as well, and saw the most unbelievable scene in his life. Above the sky that was not dark, two things that everyone was very familiar with appeared, one on the left and the other on the right. A round sun hung high in the sky on the left, shining brightly. A crescent moon hung upside down in the sky on the right, spreading a soft radiance. The sun and moon hung high in the sky. It was a marvelous sight. And beneath the two enormous radiant objects, something even more marvelous appeared. As if separated from the human world, a faint white mist appeared beneath the sun and moon, making everything seem ethereal and untraceable. Then, as if a skyscraper had risen from the ground, a magnificent temple that did not exist in the human world slowly appeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone's eyes were drawn to the high throne in the middle of the temple. A figure wearing a green robe sat upon the throne. Her body was shrouded in a layer of soft holy light, and no one could see her face clearly. They could only see a little bit of golden hair that fell to the hem of her robe, as well as the majestic scepter she held in her right hand. "My believers, are you calling for me?" she spoke. Her voice was clear and gentle, with a faint pressure that rang in everyone's ears. The goddess of nature! A low cry of surprise could be heard. Some could not help but feel reverence from the bottom of their hearts, and knelt before the figure. If there was a first, there would be a second. One after another, the tens of thousands of people in the square knelt in the direction of the throne. The figure on the throne did not say anything. She just sat there quietly. Then, a green figure appeared in the temple. It was the oracle. Beside her was a beautiful 9-colored deer. Someone recognized her. It was the oracle of the goddess of nature who had been summoned into the palace by His Majesty. Everyone watched as the oracle walked into the divine throne. He lowered his head slightly as if he was listening to something. Many people pricked up their ears, wanting to hear God's voice again. Unfortunately, this time, they could not hear anything. Then, the oracle nodded and walked out of the goddess of nature's palace. The moment she walked out, the entire divine hall disappeared bit by bit as if it had just appeared. That place became empty space again, as if nothing had ever appeared. The sky also regained its bright color, and the spectacle of the sun and moon in the sky also disappeared. Only the oracle was left standing there alone. But this time, the entire St. Vita Square was silent, and it was no longer as restless and noisy as before. No one had forgotten the scene that had just subverted their imaginations. They all looked at the oracle silently, curious about what she had just heard. Gu Shengyin did not disappoint them. She opened her mouth and said a piece of exciting news. Chapter 978. The goddess of nature has just granted me the ability to temporarily control the wind and rain. This is the blessing she has bestowed upon the Roth Empire. Gu Shengyin's voice sounded in everyone's mind. She raised the scepter in her hand and chanted an obscure incantation. A gust of wind blew past her. The sky darkened at a speed visible to the naked eye. This was different from the previous situation. The sky was gray, the prelude to an impending storm. Then, everyone watched as the terrifying lightning bolts and dark clouds moved towards the northwest. They moved further and further away, landing in every affected area. Gu Shengyin looked around at everyone, her voice resounding, "The goddess of nature has never given up on any of her people. But now, the faith of the people on the continent has greatly disappointed her." Everyone looked at her in a daze. Everything that had happened today was simply too inconceivable. Someone had placed a fact in front of them. The gods that they had never believed in actually existed. This was simply a shock that overturned everything they knew. Gu Shengyin also knew that they needed some time to recover, so she just stood there quietly, waiting for them to come back to their senses. Louis Weiss's eyes burned as he looked at the woman standing in the most prominent position. Beautiful, powerful, and dazzling. The oracle of the goddess of nature, an existence that could listen to the teachings of the gods. Her image in his mind had never been so clear before. Suddenly, the sound of chanting came from somewhere. Louis Weiss listened carefully and found that it was a hymn praising the goddess of nature. It was like a tide. Slowly, some people began to hum along with that person. Gradually, more and more people began to hum. The scattered streams converged into a river. Then, countless surging rivers finally gathered together to form a power that could shake the heavens and earth. Everyone in the square began to sing the hymn of the goddess of nature. Gu Shengyin knew that her goal had been achieved. The barrier around St. Vita Square quietly disappeared. Many people who didn't go in were shocked by the song, which was loud enough to resound throughout the city. They all asked what was going on. Then, through the mouths of those who had personally experienced this, the name of the goddess of nature began to spread. Gu Shengyin wore a smile on her face as she quietly disappeared into the crowd. As soon as she appeared in her palace, she was informed that His Majesty had summoned her. This was to be expected. Gu Shengyin arrived at the Emperor's palace. It was rare for the place to be so formal today, and there were no beautiful maids serving Phoebe. As soon as he saw Gu Shengyin, a warm smile appeared on his face. "Oracle, I saw the miracle in St. Vita Square, and I just received news from the northwest." Fibbit looked at Gu Shengyin with shining eyes. "I wish to establish the faith of the goddess of nature in the Roth Empire. I would like to seek your opinion, Lord Oracle." "That's a real god, you know." The moment he saw those miracles, there was only one thought in his mind. If such a powerful god was willing to protect the Roth Empire, if he was willing to protect the royal family, then the Roth Empire would be able to live on forever. This was the result that Gu Shengyin wanted. But there was one more thing that needed to be explained. Chapter 979. Gu Shengyin looked straight at Fibbit. "If I'm not mistaken, the Roth Empire believes in the god of war?" Fibbit's face showed a trace of awkwardness. Although their guardian was the god of war, none of the people had ever seen the god of war descend, and almost none of them still maintained their faith. He cleared his throat and said, "Our Roth Empire's guardian, according to the historical records, is the god of war. However, there are no records of the god of war blessing the Roth Empire. After seeing the goddess of nature descend, I doubt that the god of war even exists." Gu Shengyin thought, "He originally existed, but because your faith collapsed, his power was lost bit by bit, and in the end, he had no choice but to fall into an eternal slumber." Saying that there was no god's blessing, in the end, it was the result of humanity's own actions. Of course, Gu Shengyin couldn't say that out loud. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then finally nodded under Fibbit's expectant gaze. "The goddess of nature will not refuse any believer." Fibbit was overjoyed. "I'll immediately give the order to build goddess of nature temples throughout the Roth Empire." Gu Shengyin smiled. "Then I'll have to trouble your majesty." As the emperor, Fibbit's efficiency was undoubtedly very high. His order was quickly passed down. Every first-class city, with St. Vitus as an example, must have at least 2 temples of the goddess of nature. Every second and third-class city must have at least 1 temple of the goddess of nature. As for the rest of the smaller cities, a temple must be built between 2 neighboring cities. It wasn't just Emperor Fibbit, but the people's enthusiasm for the construction of temples was also unprecedentedly high. Among them, the people of St. Vitus and the northwestern region were the most enthusiastic. The former was because they had seen the goddess of nature descend with their own eyes, while the latter was because they had personally felt the gospel brought by the goddess of nature. Gu Shengyin only felt an endless stream of faith gathering in her body. According to this trend, it was only a matter of time before they returned to their heyday. She also officially moved out of the palace. Even though Emperor Fibbit repeatedly urged her to stay. This time, Emperor Fibbit didn't keep her because he had any improper thoughts, but because after seeing the strength of Gu Shengyin as an oracle, he felt that with such a strong person in the palace, his safety would be guaranteed. Even if he was given 100 guts, he wouldn't dare to lust for Gu Shengyin, who could directly communicate with the goddess of nature. In the end, Gu Shengyin decided to move out of the palace with the excuse that, since the temple has been completed, as an oracle, it is only natural for him to live in the temple. He moved to the goddess of nature's temple in St. Vitus Square. Because the goddess of nature descended at the Roth temple, and the goddess of nature, the goddess of God, the goddess of course, the goddess of God. Didn't the of the god of the goddess of the god of God of the god. Because of the god of God, it, espy by the of God to God of God. It was a good idea to build a temple here, because it was big, the temple could take up a lot of space. On this day, she left little Nine in the temple, changed into a less eye-catching outfit, and went to the agreed place to meet someone. Royd and Louis Weiss were sitting there. Royd was in a bad mood, because when he heard that the oracle was coming, Louis Weiss found a lot of reasons to come along. Chapter 980. Although he knew that his subordinate and the oracle had no time to meet, it was impossible for them to be together without him knowing. But Royd was still a little unhappy. He had reminded Louis more than once not to get too close to Gu Shengyin. But he knew in his heart that if Louis could have a closer relationship with the oracle as his subordinate, the oracle would be more dedicated to the cooperation. But he just didn't want the two of them to be together. As long as he thought that one day, Louis Vis and that oracle would become lovers, his heart would be filled with boundless tyranny and irritation. He didn't even know why it was like this. I told you to wait. The door of the private room was pushed open, and a figure walked in. Louis's eyes lit up. In order to not be discovered, Gu Shengyin had changed her oracle outfit today. She was now wearing a very popular tight-fitting waistline dress. This design of the dress revealed her tall and perfect figure without a doubt. She wore a large lace hat of the same color on her head, which covered half of her face. She also held an exquisite pink folding fan in her hand. This style was the living embodiment of a noble lady. No one would associate her with the oracle in the temple, who seemed to have a spring breeze halo. Louis went up and extended a hand. Welcome, Miss Bess. Thank you, Louis. Gu Shengyin closed her folding fan and smiled as she placed her hand in Louis's palm. Louis's eyes lit up with a hint of menace as he leaned over and planted a gentle kiss on the back of her hand. Royd suddenly coughed heavily, interrupting the joyous atmosphere between the two. Louis looked at the Duke, who was acting strangely in confusion. Royd's eyes secretly glanced at the back of Gu Shengyin's hand. He suddenly stood up and walked toward Gu Shengyin with a cold expression. Louis nervously stood in front of Gu Shengyin. He couldn't be blamed. Royd's eyes were too scary. Those who didn't know would think that he was going to fight with Gu Shengyin. Royd glanced at Louis indifferently. Move. Louis met those emotionless eyes. He clenched his fists and didn't move. Royd's voice dropped a notch. Louis, move. He had accumulated a lot of power among his subordinates. Louis met those dark blue eyes and his Adam's apple moved uneasily. In the end, he unwillingly took a step back. He still stared at Royd without blinking. He swore in his heart that if the Duke wanted to harm Miss Bess, he would not sit idly by. On the other hand, Gu Shengyin's expression didn't even change. She looked at Royd calmly, as if she wasn't worried about him. What happened next was out of their expectations. Lloyd strode to Gu Shengyin's side, and the corners of his mouth curled into a stiff smile. He extended his right hand toward Gu Shengyin. Welcome, Miss Bess. Louis was speechless. He was breaking down in his heart. It was just a welcome. Why did you have to look so fierce? Phew. Update 10. Finally, he finished writing the update before 12 o'clock. There was no update at midnight. There's still one more chapter left. Gigi will make it up as soon as possible. Good night, everyone. Also, I'd like to ask for monthly tickets, referral tickets, and tips. Chapter 981. Gu Shengyin looked much calmer than Louis Weisberg. She didn't seem to notice Royd's cold gaze as she smiled and winked. "Thank you, Your Excellency." Royd's frown deepened. She called him Louis Weiss, but she called him Duke. Did the difference in treatment have to be so obvious? He waited for her to extend her hand, but it was clear that Gu Shengyin didn't have any intention of doing so. Royd could only say impatiently, "Hand." Gu Shengyin was stunned. Seeing Royd's gaze on her left hand, she raised her hand in confusion. Then, Royd quickly grasped her hand and planted a kiss on the back of it. Gu Shengyin widened her eyes in shock. Louis looked at his superior in horror. Since when did His Excellency become so polite to a lady? After Royd finished, he quickly retracted his hand. Judging from his appearance, he seemed very unwilling to do what he had just done. "I didn't want to be rude," Royd said in his heart. "All right, Louis, we still have some things to discuss. You can leave first." Royd stood straight and mercilessly ordered his subordinate to leave. Louis was a bit reluctant, but he knew that there were some things he couldn't know. He glanced at Gu Shengyin and walked out with his head lowered. Gu Shengyin sat on a wide chair and quietly waited for Royd to speak. She thought that with this man's personality, he would definitely speak about serious matters. However, after a few minutes of silence, Royd spoke. "Your dress today is very beautiful." Gu Shengyin almost dropped the fan in her hand. She glanced at Royd in confusion and maintained a perfect smile. "Thank you for the compliment, Your Excellency." What was wrong with him? Grand Duke Royd wasn't a person who would exchange pleasantries. Looking at Gu Shengyin's strange and conflicted expression, Lloyd lowered his eyes. There was no joy on his face at all. Damned books. Didn't they say that a good conversation should start with a good topic? According to his knowledge, praising a woman's beauty or praising her beauty was undoubtedly the easiest way to gain their approval. But Royd was dismayed to find that this trick had no effect on the oracle of the goddess of nature. The other party was only puzzled for a moment before his expression returned to normal. It was as if he didn't hear him. Next time, he must have a good talk with the person who wrote this book about life. Gu Shengyin saw that the atmosphere between the two of them had become awkward again. She could only sigh and take the initiative to find a topic to talk about. "Your Grace, you sent a message asking to meet with me. Is there something you need?" she asked. Seeing that the other party had taken the initiative to talk about business, Royd breathed a sigh of relief. He said with a cold expression, "There are many goddess of nature temples in St. Vitus. We..." The man's mellow voice resounded in the room. When he was talking about business, his handsome face was serious and could not be ignored. If a serious man was the most handsome, then this man was the most handsome at all times. Chapter 982. After Royd finished speaking, he stopped and looked at Gu Shengyin. Speaking of which, looking at the current situation, he felt that this oracle did not take advantage of him in any way. With her ability, she could clearly spread the faith of the goddess of nature by herself. However, it would be difficult for him to obtain that position without hurting the foundation. When he looked over, she was sitting on the chair with her hands crossed on her knees. Her posture was very elegant. Her eyes were focused on him. It was obvious that she had been listening to him very carefully. Royd was very satisfied with this. He appreciated this attitude. Of course, if he knew what this elegant oracle was thinking, he might not be so pleased. Gu Shengyin was talking to the system. "System, don't you think he's very good-looking?" "System." The system answered very cautiously, "According to human aesthetics, this duke is a very rare handsome man." Gu Shengyin smiled and nodded, "I think so too." When he turned around, she had stopped talking and was obviously asking for his opinion. The contents of the conversation flashed through her mind. Gu Shengyin maintained her perfect smile and nodded, "There are no problems, Your Grace. I hope our cooperation can continue." Royd looked at Gu Shengyin carefully and confirmed that she was not unwilling at all. He felt a little relieved, but he could not help but ask, "Forgive me for being blunt, Miss Beezy. With your ability and the power of the goddess of nature, It is not difficult to spread the faith of the goddess of nature across the entire continent. Why would you choose to continue working with me? Royd was certain that with such an oracle, no faction would refuse to work with her. Gu Shengyin was not surprised to hear this question. She smiled and looked at Royd. After my reputation spread, there were many people who were willing to work with me. However, when I was unknown, there were not many who had the courage to believe in me and work with me, Your Grace. What's more, she smiled, I can see that although His Excellency the Duke has no faith, he is an upright and sincere person. Working with someone like you, I don't have to worry about bad things happening in the future, right? From Royd's point of view, he saw her gently looking at him. Her delicate face walked into his eyes for the first time so straightforwardly and powerfully. His pupils shrank slightly, but they soon returned to normal. Thank you for your answer. Gu Shengyin smiled and stood up. It's no trouble. Your Grace, if you have any questions or plans in the future, you can contact me at any time. Royd saw that she wanted to leave, so he got up and walked in front of her to open the door. Louis, who had been waiting outside, saw Gu Shengyin, and his eyes lit up. Master Bizi, have you finished your discussion with the Duke? Do you have any plans for the next few days? Can I invite you to have lunch with me? I know a restaurant in the city. She doesn't have time. Royd coldly cut him off. Under Louis's confused and gloomy gaze, Royd turned his head and looked at Gu Shengyin with shining eyes. Lady Bizi, please. Chapter 983. Gu Shengyin looked at Royd in surprise. She didn't understand when she had an appointment with him. However, this wasn't the right time to embarrass him. Gu Shengyin smiled and followed Royd's direction into the carriage. Royd didn't leave. He stood there and watched Gu Shengyin look at the carriage before turning to Louisville, who didn't know what was going on. Louis, he called out his subordinate's nickname. I know how you feel about her, but I'm warning you for the last time. Don't get involved with her. Royd's tone was very serious. Louisville didn't listen this time. Instead, he looked at his superior and asked, Why, Your Grace? I feel that Miss Bess is a very outstanding and beautiful woman. I have the freedom to pursue her. Why? Royd repeated these 3 words and suddenly smiled. Then I'll tell you. Royd looked at his subordinate and said word by word, Because she will be mine. After he finished speaking, he no longer paid any attention to his dumbstruck subordinate and strode towards the carriage. Because there was a lady in the carriage, Royd didn't get in out of respect. Instead, he rode his horse and followed beside the carriage. Under his command, the carriage slowly moved in a certain direction. A cool breeze brushed past his face and woke Royd up. He didn't expect that he would say that in front of his subordinates. In fact, he had never thought that he would have such feelings for the oracle. He didn't even think about it before they met today. Perhaps it was the moment she said she could trust him that something buried in his heart quietly sprouted. Royd was never someone who would run away from reality. Since he had such thoughts, he wasn't going to hide it from her or test her. Instead, he was going to tell her openly. What if she didn't like him? Royd refused to accept this possibility. Anyway, as long as he was around, no other man would appear by her side. Your Grace. A gentle voice came from the carriage. Can you explain to me where you're taking me? Royd could roughly guess the expression of the person in the carriage. She would probably frown slightly. She would at most show a hint of helplessness after such a rude thing was done to her. She would not be angry, let alone lose her poise because of it. Lunch, Royd replied. Gu Shengyin. When did she agree to have lunch with him? She said, Your Excellency, I didn't promise you. Royd's voice came through the thick curtains. I have something important to tell you. All right then. Gu Shengyin shut her mouth. If there was something, she wouldn't say much. But why didn't he tell her everything in one go in that room just now? The carriage stopped at a place. The curtain of the carriage was lifted and a hand reached out. Gu Shengyin was startled. She put her hand on the hand and used his strength to get off the carriage. Thank you, Your Excellency. She leaned to the side and thanked him. Royd felt the residual warmth in his hand and felt a bit regretful that she took it back so quickly. You're welcome. Chapter 1000. Gao Lengji's first 1000 chapters novel was a very memorable number. Chapter 984. What's this? Gu Shengyin looked at his surroundings in surprise. She thought that the food he was talking about would be in one of the more famous restaurants in St. Vita City. But this place, no matter how she looked at it, looked like an ordinary house. Royd walked straight ahead and gestured for Gu Shengyin to follow him. This is one of my courtyards. The servants who had received the news had already opened the door and tidied everything up, waiting for their master to arrive. As they walked, Royd introduced the place to Gu Shengyin. I have a chef who has been here for more than 20 years. His skills are comparable to those of the royal chefs in the palace. As Gu Shengyin listened to him, she was secretly surprised. Based on her understanding of Royd, he wasn't a talkative person. But now, he seemed to have unlimited enthusiasm and was trying his best to find a topic to talk about. It was rare for the master to come, but this courtyard, which had been quiet all year round, seemed to be filled with life again. The two sat in the pavilion with exquisite snacks and drinks in front of them. All right, Your Grace, the important matter you mentioned? Gu Shengyin didn't forget that he had brought her here. That. Royd's lips twitched as he looked at Gu Shengyin with an inexplicable expression. Gu Shengyin felt that there was something wrong with his gaze. She hurriedly communicated with the system. System, there hasn't been anything that's disadvantageous to me recently, right? The system's answer was very certain. No, host. That's good. Gu Shengyin relaxed and looked at Royd calmly. Then she heard the man's thin lips slightly open as he said, I realize that I like you, BZ. Are you willing to rule the Rota Empire with me after I achieve my goal? Gu Shengyin's first reaction was that something was wrong. She couldn't be blamed for feeling strange. After all this time, she had never felt any affection from Royd. She had once thought that this man did not have any romantic feelings in his heart. How could she have known that this confession would come so unexpectedly? So much so that her calm face cracked for a moment. Royd was very happy to see this. He always thought that Bai Si was used to being an oracle and always maintained a compassionate and gentle expression. That kind of expression, compared to a person, was more like a deity without any worries or emotions. He was very happy to see her surprised expression. This way she would be closer to a human. Gu Shengyin came back to her senses and met Lloyd's burning gaze. He looked at her without blinking. It seemed that he was determined to get an accurate answer from her. Actually, Royd wasn't as strong as he appeared to be. He had never liked anyone before, so he didn't know what kind of development was right. He had already made sure that no one of the opposite sex was around her, so that he was the only one in her line of sight. However, he couldn't guarantee that she would fall in love with him. Gu Shengyin was stunned for a few seconds. Suddenly, a completely different and human smile appeared on her face. It was a smile that Royd liked very much. What a coincidence. I happen to like the Duke very much too, she said slowly. Today, after washing my hair, I had a migraine attack and couldn't write anymore. In one night, I barely wrote 4,000 chapters. I'm really sorry. Including the one I owed previously, I owed a total of 5 chapters. Gigi promised to make up for it in the future. I'm sorry to ask for your votes today. Wu percent. 100% good night, everyone. Chapter 985. Such a straightforward admission stunned Royd. Of course, his face, which only had one expression all year round, was stunned. But the shock in his heart was indescribable. When he said that sentence, he was prepared to receive any response. Moreover, in his heart, he believed that the possibility of rejection was quite high. Lloyd knew himself well. He knew that the most attractive aspects of him to women were none other than his noble status, great wealth, and handsome looks. In the eyes of this oracle, these three things were not enough to attract her. Then, personality? Royd shook his head inwardly. He knew himself very well. With his personality, he was definitely not the type to be liked. Gu Shengyin looked at the tense and expressionless face in front of her, as if he was thinking. But she knew that at this moment, this man was probably just in a daze. She used the fan to cover half of her face and called out, "Your Excellency the Duke?" Royd quickly came back to his senses. "Call me Royd." Gu Shengyin blinked and went along with his wishes. Royd. Sure enough, it sounded much better than Your Excellency the Duke. Royd thought to himself silently. In an instant, Royd came back to his senses. He looked at the smiling woman in front of him and suddenly stood up. "Wait here for a moment." Then he turned around and strode away. What kind of development was this? At this time, as the man who confessed first, shouldn't he say some sweet words to coax her? Gu Shengyin put down the fan in her hand and took a sip of the tea on the table. "System, what do you think he's doing?" The servants in this courtyard did not dare to approach her, so she could only talk to the system. The system indicated that it did not want to answer this kind of question. But it didn't seem good to leave the host hanging. Moreover, what if in the future? Thinking of a possibility that was almost the truth, the system felt that its attitude could be better to the person in front of it. "Host, the system feels that, according to human logic, it will be a pleasant surprise," the system replied. Gu Shengyin was actually just bored and chatted with the system. As the system had been single for 10,000 years, Gu Shengyin did not think that it would be able to give any constructive suggestions. Forever single system, Gu Shengyin asked, "How is he doing?" When it came to work, the system's actions were much smoother. A long string of information quickly entered Gu Shengyin's mind. It was He's recent experience, and it was very detailed. Just as Gu Shengyin had expected, without the powerful goddess of nature, He's days were not very good. She was still the oracle of the water god who had long fallen into a deep slumber. An oracle without the protection of a god could be seen by referring to the current situation of the Kapuna family where Louis was from. Needless to say, the entire Roth Empire was now slowly gathering the faith of the goddess of nature. This was also imperceptibly weakening the influence of the remaining gods. Naturally, He's days were even more difficult. Being forced to live had already consumed all of her energy. Not to mention that her ambition was growing day by day like in the original plot, and she even wanted to replace the position of the goddess of nature. All He wanted now was to be able to live a comfortable life like before. In a different position, the things one wanted would be completely different. This was indeed the case. Chapter 986. Gu Shengyin was letting her imagination run wild when Royd returned. She noticed that Royd seemed to be holding something in his hand. He walked to the table and sat down. Then he pushed the thing in his hand toward Gu Shengyin. It was a small box with a very delicate shape. It seemed to be made of gold and was inlaid with many large gems. Rather than a container, it was more like an exquisite piece of art. Royd looked at Gu Shengyin with an urging gaze. He seemed to want her to open it immediately. Gu Shengyin was a little curious. What could be stored in such an exquisite little box? She put down the folding fan in her hand and put her hand on the latch. With a click, the box's latch was opened. Gu Shengyin thought that it might be an exquisite piece of art, precious gems, or beautiful jewelry. However, it wasn't. Inside this small box was a whole box of neatly arranged badges of honor. These badges made of gold shone brightly in the sun. "This is..." Gu Shengyin looked at Royd in surprise. Royd just looked at her quietly and said, "There's another layer below." He just wanted her to continue looking. Gu Shengyin reached out and touched it. Sure enough, she found a small mechanism in the box's interlayer. Taking out the box full of badges, there were many pieces of white paper lying quietly under it, and even some pieces of yellow paper. She glanced at Royd. He was looking at her without blinking. "Open it and take a look." Gu Shengyin took out 2 pieces of paper and opened them in front of him. Gu Shengyin looked at Royd in surprise. One of the two pieces of paper was the title deed of a castle and the other was the title deed of a manor. There was a thick layer of paper below. It wasn't hard to guess what was inside. Gu Shengyin put down the paper in her hand. She looked at Royd and asked, "This is?" Royd didn't look at the box. His attention was on Gu Shengyin. "I've read in a book that if you like someone, you have to share your most precious things and all your wealth with them," Royd said. Royd said, "The badge on top is my honor and something I'm willing to protect with my life. Below is all the wealth I have. Now, I'm willing to give it all to you." Even Gu Shengyin couldn't help but be moved when she heard such straightforward and passionate words. This man didn't say any sweet nothings to her, but what he did was more touching than any sweet nothings in the world. Gu Shengyin couldn't help but laugh. "But Royd, we haven't reached that stage yet. You have to give these things to your future wife." Royd frowned. "You and I have already connected our hearts. Don't you plan to marry me in the future? If you want to hold a wedding immediately, it's indeed inconvenient. After all, my current identity is sensitive. Being with me will have a bad impact on you." He frowned as if seriously considering the feasibility of this matter. Gu Shengyin looked at him and finally couldn't help but laugh. She reached out and covered his hand. "No, I won't marry anyone else. I swear to the goddess of nature that my husband will only be you." Chapter 987. Royd's face was stiff as he held Gu Shengyin's hand in his. If one took a closer look, one could see that his ears were slightly red. He said in a low voice, "Shouldn't the man say it first?" Gu Shengyin didn't give him face this time and laughed out loud. By the time the two of them had finished their heart-to-heart talk, a sumptuous lunch was already prepared. After the two finished their lunch, they enjoyed the scenery for a while before Royd sent her back to the temple in St. Vitus Square. "Goodbye, Royd." Gu Shengyin turned around and said to him. This was the back of the temple, where Gu Shengyin usually lived and no outsiders could come in. Lloyd suddenly strode toward her, leaned over, and kissed her on the cheek. His actions were done in one smooth motion. "The book says that couples can have some intimate interactions when they say goodbye," he said with a straight face. Gu Shengyin looked at his red ears, held back her laughter, and copied him. She tiptoed and kissed him on his left cheek. Royd turned around and left, satisfied. When he returned to his duke's mansion, the butler reported that Count Louis had been waiting for a long time. Lloyd had long expected that Louis Vis would come. He took the horsewhip in his hand and threw it to the butler, then went straight to the study. "Your Grace." Louise greeted him as soon as she saw him, but she didn't know what to say after greeting him. Ever since the two of them left in the morning, he had been in a daze. How could the Duke say something like that? He thought for a long time and finally decided to come to the Duke's mansion to ask. But the butler told him that the Duke wasn't there. He waited for a few hours. He had a lot of questions to ask. What did the Duke mean by what he said earlier? Did he really have a relationship with Miss Bess? Even if they were out for so long, were they dating? But when he saw Royd, he found that he couldn't ask at all. Royd sat calmly in his seat and looked at his subordinate's conflicted expression. He didn't feel guilty at all. If he was not mistaken, Louis had liked Bai Si for a long time. But all his time was spent on hesitation and cautiously approaching. When it came to such matters, once he had made up his mind, he should act decisively, regardless of the outcome. If the other party also liked him, it would naturally be a happy ending. If the other party had no feelings for him, Grand Duke Royd said that he would try his best to make the other party like him. That was how domineering they were. If you drag things out and end up with nothing in the end, who can you blame? He waited for a while to make sure that his subordinate still had no intention of speaking. "Louis." He called out his subordinate's nickname in a deep voice. The two of them were about the same age and had grown up together. The Kapuna family had always been his loyal followers. Although the two of them were superior and subordinate, they were more like brothers most of the time. Of course, if Royd was referring to his brother, King Phoebe, then his relationship with Louis Weiss was much better than that of blood brothers. Louise stood up straight out of reflex and looked at Royd. "What do you want to ask me?" Louis's heart trembled, and his gaze finally became firm. Chapter 988. What's your relationship with Lady by Sea? Louis asked. Royd nodded. As you thought, we're together. Louis's gaze trembled, and he felt his heart empty for a moment. He forced a smile. Is that so? Then I wish you. Having just found out that his sweetheart was someone else's lover, one could imagine the dejection in Louis's heart. He still couldn't say the words of blessing out loud. But Royd didn't care about this. He looked at his good brother and spoke without a trace of euphemism. I'm well aware of your feelings for her. I don't care about how it was in the past, but from today onwards, Louis, you have to put away these thoughts and suppress them. You have to remember, she's mine. Louis forced a smile. Of course I know that. He still had a bit of moral integrity, but he still felt some regret in his heart. It was the first time in his life that he was moved by a woman, but he couldn't even confess. Royd trusted his brother's character, and telling him was just a declaration of male sovereignty. After settling his private matters, Royd began to put his thoughts on business. His actions were already not slow, but now there was another motivation to push him forward. He wanted to make himself and by sea official as soon as possible. With his current situation, if he married by sea, Phoebe would definitely start to doubt and even reject by sea. The current faith in the goddess of nature had not yet fully grown, and if Phoebe was determined to resist the divine right, it would definitely cause a storm, and by sea's previous efforts would basically be in vain. Gu Shengyin roughly understood her thoughts, and the various activities in the temple began to become more frequent, and there was even another god's descent. Sure enough, Phoebe began to firmly believe in the goddess of nature, and there were more and more believers in the Roth Empire. There were even many people who spontaneously went to the temple to pray regularly and requested to hold a ceremony for the goddess of nature. The so-called ceremony was a large-scale event. On the day of the god's birthday, prayers would be held, and believers would offer their loyal faith and carefully prepared gifts for the god. Phoebe hesitated for a moment. He had already begun to realize that the development of the divine right seemed to be somewhat out of control. When he accepted the faith of the goddess of nature, his initial purpose was to make it serve the royal authority. But now, the goddess of nature was showing signs of surpassing the royal authority. This kind of thing was intolerable to anyone in power. However, how could Gu Shengyin let him disagree? The holy water bestowed by the goddess of nature allowed Phoebe's weak body to regain its strength. It also made his faith in the goddess go up a notch. With a wave of his hand, Phoebe passed the case. Gu Shengyin looked at all of this with a smile, feeling the power of faith from the Roth Empire surround her. Her temple had now regained its glory. The ceremony of the goddess of nature had passed this year and was scheduled for next year. There were still 8 months left. With the protection of the goddess of nature, Phoebe became more and more arrogant and unscrupulous in his actions. He kidnapped women, increased taxes, and wasted money to build a temporary palace. The people of the Roth Empire were becoming more and more dissatisfied with the royal family. Gu Shengyin coldly watched Phoebe continue to court disaster. See you tonight. Chapter 989. Clang. Phoebe fiercely threw the thing in his hand to the ground. A group of lowly fellows, actually vainly trying to resist the powerful bearer of dynasty. Phoebe fiercely gulped down a mouthful of tea, his eyes bloodshot. This was the third uprising that had occurred in the past month. The first 2 were caused by ordinary citizens, but this time it was caused by the lord of a manor with a noble title. Although each movement was suppressed by the Empire's army, Phoebe understood that he no longer had the will of the people. Where's the oracle? Quickly ask her to come. At this time, the only person he could think of to help him was Gu Shengyin. Currently, the people of the Roth Empire were very worshipful of the goddess of nature. If the oracle was willing to stand by his side and say that the Berev dynasty's ruling position was recognized by the gods, he was confident that he could make the people settle down. Gu Shengyin came quickly. Oracle, quickly go and pray to the goddess of nature. Have her issue an oracle to make those lowly commoners work properly and not think about those useless things. Phoebe said. Gu Shengyin looked at him with a strange gaze. Your Majesty, do you still remember what I told you? Don't be too harsh on your people. Use the money you spent on the palace to level the roads in remote areas. Phoebe irritably interrupted her. I don't want to hear this. How could I be threatened by those lowly commoners? Oracle, you only need to do as I say. Gu Shengyin's expression didn't change. Then I will try to communicate with the gods. She walked out of the palace and saw a maid carrying tea walking towards the main hall with a nervous expression. Nowadays, no matter who it was, when they went to see His Majesty, they all kept quiet out of fear that when they went in to serve him, His Majesty would be in a bad mood. A punishment was already a light punishment. If it was serious, they might even lose their lives. Gu Shengyin sighed inwardly and continued to walk forward. On the way, the gods saw her and saluted her. The faces of these people were all numb. The imperial palace, the dynasty, had already begun to rot from the inside. In contrast to the imperial capital, in the distant northwestern region of the empire, the people there lived a rich and leisurely life. Their family's warehouse was filled with food, and they wore thick clothes in the winter. The elderly and children all had happy smiles on their faces. That was the territory of Grand Duke Royd. Gu Shengyin slowly closed her eyes. When she opened her eyes again, the scene in front of her had changed. The imperial city was no longer what it looked like on a normal day. The originally empty sky was now filled with colorful spots of light. The light spots were of different colors and represented different emotions. Green represented comfort, yellow represented fear, gray represented despair, and red represented anger. These were the emotions of the believers of the goddess of nature. Gu Shengyin only needed to feel them slightly to be able to clearly hear their inner thoughts. But it was very clear that in the sky, the proportion of green light spots was getting smaller and smaller, and the proportion of yellow and gray was gradually increasing. Fibbit's rule made these people unable to see a trace of hope. Wait a little longer. Gu Shengyin said softly in her heart, soon, there will be a person who will lead his army to rescue you from this mire of despair. Chapter 990. Time passed by quickly. When the harvest season of the second year arrived, the people of the Roth Empire welcomed the goddess of nature's festival. Gu Shengyin made ample preparations for this. Emperor Phoebe had also made sufficient preparations. He still hoped that this ceremony would be able to calm the restless people down. As the most famous oracle of the goddess of nature, Gu Shengyin stayed at the goddess of nature's temple in St. Vita City. As for the festivals in other places, they were also handled by different oracles. Gu Shengyin had already discussed with Royd that they would bring a big gift to Phoebe and the entire Roth Empire. On this day, Gu Shengyin was dressed very formally. Phoebe also led the royal family to the goddess of nature's temple in formal attire to show their respect. The huge square of the temple was already densely packed with believers. Among these believers, some were nobles in bright clothes. They wore exquisite clothes, and the ladies even sprinkled perfume, competing with each other to the side. Most of them were ordinary people. The only thing they could do was to wear clean and tidy clothes, so as not to tarnish the goddess of nature's festival. Gu Shengyin even saw homeless people on the streets who only had one set of clothes. In the cold wind of late autumn, they took off their clothes and carefully washed them, smoothed them out, and hung them out in the sun. At night, they slept in a pile of hay, shivering. Many of the believers put their treasures into a huge container in the middle of the square. This container was used to store the gifts that the believers gave to the goddess of nature. It was a huge transparent glass container, and when things were put inside, they could be seen clearly. Some nobles put their favorite jewelry inside, some merchants put a bag of gold coins inside, some young girls put their favorite flowers inside, and some children gave their favorite toys to the goddess. They looked like they were about to cry, because their mothers told them that they must give their most precious things to the goddess. There were even farmers in simple clothes who put a small bag of food. For them, food that could keep them from starving was the most precious thing in the world. Gu Shengyin kept a smile on her face as she watched all this, until the clock tower's bell rang, signaling the start of the festival. At this moment, everyone in the square saw a green light sprinkle down from the sky, falling on everyone's body. Being enveloped by this green light, everyone felt their body and mind relax. Then, the glass container that carried the good wishes of the believers suddenly became empty. The gifts that were given to the gods also disappeared at the same time as the green light disappeared. The goddess of nature has received your gifts, Gu Shengyin said to her believers with a smile. Immediately, a burst of loud cheers erupted from the square. Phoebe was a little dejected. He had just relied on his status and was unwilling to put the gifts into the container with the commoners. This way, the goddess didn't see his gifts at all. Then, Gu Shengyin began to stand alone on the high altar, chanting hymns. All the believers maintained a pious posture. According to the records, after this ceremony, if the goddess was satisfied with this festival, she might personally descend. The goddess's descent. This was the dream of all the believers. There were more at night. Today, there were more chapters. Tonight, they would shamelessly ask for a wave of monthly votes. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.